gas station in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. If you ever see it, keep driving." "Shit!" the tires screamed in protest as I jerked the steering wheel to the right. The cabin was briefly illuminated by intense white spotlights, and a deep horn blared so loudly that it nearly ruptured my eardrums. My existence appeared before my eyes for a brief while, and then I was jostled around by the uneven grassy roadside. Less than a foot separated me from the 18-wheeler that had swerved into my lane, speeding past at what must have been 70 miles per hour or more. I jerked down the driver's window switch and put my head out into the pounding rain after taking a moment to regain my breath. "Asshole!" Even though I knew the logging truck's driver couldn't hear me, I yelled at it as it fled. A second later, the voice of a furious woman erupted from my rental Chrysler 300's speakers. "I implore you to forgive me." I sat back down in the seat after coming to my senses and realizing that I had been on the phone. The speakers paused for a while before my agent gave a little snort. "Not you, Aaron," I responded regretfully. "If you didn't hear the commotion on my end of the line, I almost got splattered all over the front end of some moron's Peterbilt who wandered over to my side of the road." "Well, isn't it simply magnificent?" The tone softened. "You have to love idiots on the roads these days." "I'm relieved that you avoided an accident, Al." I chuckled. "I don't feel like losing my closest friend and best client all at once." I said, "It helps me relax to know you care." After a little while, I relaxed my muscles and put the car back on the road, continuing on. In the winter of 22, I was traveling from my home in Gold Beach, Oregon, to Seattle for a book signing. I was a writer who had just broken the New York Times bestseller list with my first book. As a result, I was embarking on a nationwide book signing tour. Naturally, I have changed my name along with others, since if I used my real name, many people would instantly recognize who I am. My literary agent, Aaron, had recommended that I take a plane from the North Bend Airport to Seattle, but I've had severe anxiety related to flying since the September 11th attacks in 2001. Knowing that I hadn't yet bought a new vehicle to replace my pretty dilapidated and broken down one, she had instead set me up with a rental, and I had started the nearly 7.5-hour drive north. I murmured, "If Interstate 5 hadn't been congested with that accident, I wouldn't have had to deal with those dingbats." "Well, you wanted to drive, Al," Aaron's scathing voice said over the speakers. "Are you aware of your location?" I must have looked at the GPS map for the umpteenth time. As the antenna on top of the car tried to connect to a circling satellite overhead, the screen almost looked to malfunction, leaping. A piece of shit. I sneered. "No, it seems like this dumb navigation system is having problems." I glanced back up in time to see a sign with the gas symbol flashing past, thinking, so much for Enterprise being a good car rental company. I thought, thank you God for little favors. "Hey, there will be a gas station shortly. I'll stop there, get directions, and then give you a call when I'm on my way, because I'm a little low anyhow." On the speakers, there was a sigh. "All okay, but try not to be too long, all right? If you arrive late for your first book signing tomorrow, the publishing house won't be pleased," she remarked. After saying reassuringly, "I'll be as quick as I can," I ended the call by pressing the red disconnect button on the steering wheel. I breathed a sigh of relief. Aaron had been my savior and had arranged my contract, which included a very large advance, but dealing with her had eventually become tiresome. With the exception of the rain hitting the car's windshield, the wipers turning off, and the tires on the damp pavement, I enjoyed the quiet as I gazed out the windshield at the two-lane road ahead. For a few more minutes, all I could see were countless trees encroaching on the road, almost as if they were vying for attention from the cars that passed by. Then I noticed the bright lights ahead on the right like a lighthouse beacon, almost as if my thoughts had called for them. It was evident that it had been here for a very long time, Based on its general appearance, it appeared to have existed since the 1950s, if not before. When I noticed the station's illuminated emblem whirling in a leisurely circle on its pole, I let out a startled moan. I assumed I would never see the fading green outline of a brontosaurus and the similarly aged red letters that spell out Sinclair in person, because the company had ceased operations in March. I suppose no one mentioned it to the owner of this one. A classic bell ring loudly twice, someplace out of sight, when my tires drove over a small black wire as I drew into the station. I turned off the engine when I pulled up next to the green pump and settled back into the cozy leather while listening to the engine's cooling tick. The only sounds I could hear when I closed my eyes were the rain hitting the metal awning over the pumps and the loud buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Hearing the rain stop, I opened my eyes and gazed around, taking in the analog clock on the dash that was lit by the overhead lights. 7:30 p.m. It was already 10 minutes. I let out a sigh. I mumbled, "Come on, man," and tapped the horn rapidly. Its loud sound nearly broke the silence like a baseball hitting a plate glass window. Still no one. I said, "Damn it," then unbuckled my seatbelt, tugged on the handle, and kicked open the door with my foot. I stepped out onto the cracked concrete, and a freezing wind slammed into my face, making me flip up my coat collar. I looked about, but all I could hear were crickets chirping, the wind tearing through the trees, and what must have been an owl's hoots in the forest beyond. There was no mechanic in sight, but the garage bays were open, and I could see what appeared to be a 1950s Cadillac and a 1970s International Scout up on the lifts in the dim, yellowed light of what must have been old incandescent lamps. I leaned on the horn, longer this time, and leaned back into the automobile. The sound bounced off the station and trees once more. I shivered at the sound for some reason. To break the silence here is nearly sacrilegious. I gave a headshake. What on earth was the source of the thought? I ignored it and waited for about a minute more. Life was still nowhere to be seen. Perhaps the station is closed after all. It was a concerning idea because, aside from the stupid logging truck, I hadn't seen any other traces of civilization for 2.5 hours. Even though the Chrysler had been running well on petrol, I didn't want to try driving farther on just a quarter tank, because I didn't know how far it was till the next town or gas station. I made the decision to find out for myself and loudly thudded the driver's door shut. With my footsteps echoing back at me, I stepped around the front of the automobile and crossed to the open bays. As I looked around, I saw the oil that had poured on the floor and the hoses, bottles, and mismatched instruments that were heaving haphazardly on the back bench. But didn't see anyone. Fantastic, I thought as I glanced up to watch the dazzling moon emerge from behind the clouds. I was about to turn and start walking in the direction of what must have been a convenience shop or office when the figure exploded out of the door, almost making me jump out of my skin. Oh. I uncontrollably laughed, and I got a friendly chuckle in response. "I apologize, sir. I didn't intend to startle you or keep you waiting for so long." After catching my breath, I looked up at the man and laughed strainedly. Wearing a green Sinclair jumpsuit with the same green dinosaur on the front patch, he looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Harold was written on the reverse side of the patch. He slicked back the last of the hair on his head and gave me a smile that was startlingly bright white. With a sigh of relief, I raised my hand and gave it a slight wobble. "Dude, don't worry about it," I responded, my voice becoming steady again. For a moment, I thought this place was permanently closed or something. "Just the fact that I'm the only one working the night shifts, sir," wiping his brow jokingly, he declared. I grinned and snorted. It was obvious that the man had a good sense of humor. "You probably need gas." He pointed to my automobile and shifted the conversation to business. I gave a nod. He nodded and started to walk toward it as I rushed back around, opening the driver's door and pressing the button to pop the gas cap. "Yes, please, if you could fill her up with regular." Pulling the pump from its cradle, Harold whistled softly. "Excellent vehicle, sir." He looked at it and exclaimed, "It appears pricey," I said with a shoulder shrug. As he slipped the nozzle in and tugged on the handle, he cocked an eyebrow at me and said, "It's a nice car, a Chrysler 300S, but unfortunately it's not mine." I hastily added, "It's a rental," after noticing that it sounded like I had jacked it or something. He seems to calm down. I jerked my thumb at the open bays as he remarked jokingly, "Ah, that makes sense. It's nicer and newer than anything we normally see out here normally." "Given that there is a 55 Coupe de Ville back there," I remarked, "I'd say you have people with good taste around here." With a nod of approval, he laughed. He looked at the pump's readout and stated, impressed, "I see you know your cars." "I love them," I answered. "So are you some sort of auto collector or race car driver then?" he asked, turning back to face me. He inquired. I gave a head shake. "No, I'm afraid not." He snapped his head up and said, "I'm a writer." His green eyes seemed to sparkle in the fluorescent lights. "A author? Wow, I never imagined having a god-to-honest writer at my station." He smiled and exclaimed. I nodded as a wave of uneasy feelings passed over me. I still hadn't adjusted to how people responded when they found out what I did for a living. He pushed forward. "What genres do you write?" With excitement, he inquired. He grinned broadly at the news when I confessed, "I write in the horror genre, honestly. My favorite genre of novels to read is horror." He uttered those words. "I adore everything, even Stephen King and the timeless classics." He gave me a questioning glance. "To date, how many have you written?" I gestured with one finger. He nodded in agreement, then turned back to the pump before continuing. "Just one published. I'm actually on the way up to a publicity signing right now." "So, have you ever witnessed anything genuinely frightful?" I arched an eyebrow in response to his query. That was a totally unexpected development. "By that, what do you mean?" In response, I inquired. He responded, but he continued to watch the pumps. Numerous horror authors that I've heard of discuss their own terrifying experiences, whether they were supernatural or just a regular scare. It enables them to produce genuinely terrifying stories. He turned back to face me. There was a smirk on his face that made me shiver a little inside. For a second, it felt nearly too wide. Then, as I blinked, I saw that it was simply a smile, albeit a little strange one. "You must have seen something because of the lighting." He was done. We were silent for a time as I considered his query, interrupted only by an owl's shriek in the encroaching darkness. "So I was just asking if you'd ever had a scary experience which got you into writing horror." I shrugged after that. "To be honest, I'm sorry to let you down, but no," I said. He looked at me with mild surprise. "Really?" I nodded, choosing to tell him the truth. "Indeed. As much as I enjoy writing, reading, and watching horror, to be perfectly honest with you, Harold, I've stopped being afraid of it a while ago." His face appeared to light up in astonishment. "Really?" He said it again before turning back to face the pump. He remarked, "That's a shame," with a hint of melancholy in his voice. I had to agree with him, so I nodded. "Yes, it is. I used to like being frightened by a good horror movie or book, but as I grew older, it just seemed to fade. Like with my first book here, I now only write about things that I know make people nervous, but really, I loathe to acknowledge that I don't feel that anxiety when I write. I had even lied about it in my first online magazine interview about my novel, claiming that I could be terrified of my own work. In a way, though, it was satisfying to tell someone, Even if it was only a complete stranger, the truth at last. When I looked up, he was staring at me with a fairly intense and, to be honest, really unsettling expression. His smile had vanished entirely, and his green eyes seemed to shine in the lights. I recoiled at the sudden shift in his attitude, but it vanished as fast, to be replaced by the smile I had known when he first showed here. With what seemed like sincere pity in his voice, he remarked, "Well, I'm sure if you search hard enough, you'll find that feeling again." Gazing out into the trees, I nodded. I honestly said, "I hope." And then I heard the pump finally click off. "Oh, everything is finished," Harold exclaimed with joy as he removed the pump from the vehicle and put it back in its cradle. He examined the readout. "That comes to 2317. I got a little started. 3/4 of a tank for less than $24. Though I wasn't going to complain about a good thing. I hadn't heard of gas this inexpensive since I was at least a teenager." I took my wallet out of my back pocket and took out my credit card. "Are you able to take credit?" I asked, half expecting him to say that he didn't. However, he joyfully removed the card from my grasp. "Naturally, we do, Mr." He glanced at my card's name. "Mr. Damascus. But the credit card reader is back inside the main building." He pointed to the door from which he had come. "If I took it back there and ran it, would that be okay with you?" I gave a head shake. I said, "No, go ahead, go ahead." And he walked back across to the building, turning away. "Bob is your uncle, and I'll be back out with your receipt before you know it." He dialed. When I realized something, I laughed again at the term I hadn't heard in years. This was the first time I had seen the man's back since he had originally appeared. One item caught my attention, even though the back of his jumpsuit was the same shade of green as the front and had a red oil rag sticking out of the back pocket. Just beneath the enormous logo patch on the back, there appeared to be a large tear in it, almost if he had been slashed. Beneath that, I could see a white shirt that was equally stained. "Hey!" I screamed at him. He paused, still grinning, and turned back to face me. "Yes?" he inquired. I gestured toward my back. "You know, there's a big rip in the back of your jumpsuit. In case you were unaware, I just wanted to let you know." He briefly displayed the same amusing expression before dismissively waving his hand. "Oh, I understand. I still haven't had a chance to patch things up." After saying that, he held up a finger to pull open the door, which made a bell dangle from the inside handle, and entered. Once more, I found myself alone, and the only sound in the abrupt silence was the buzzing of the lights, which nearly made my ears ring. I moved to the front of the car and leaned against the hood, looking out into the darkness, not wanting to appear impolite by waiting back in the car. As I waited for Harold to come back, my gaze wandered into the darkness. At that moment, I finally turned to look at the big sign in front of me. It was the one that displayed the gas price per gallon, and I hadn't even looked at it because I had pulled in from the opposite direction and had become preoccupied with my conversation. The light inside that showed the pricing at night flickered on and off, giving the impression that it would burn out at any moment, making it obvious that it had fallen into some disrepair. In the quiet, you could even hear it flickering loudly. However, that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was the rates on the flashing placard that caught my attention. "There isn't even the slightest possibility," I muttered to myself. I continued to focus on the top two figures as I scanned down. Regular is 88 cents per gallon. A tiny feeling of bewilderment washed over me. There was no way that this station would charge that little for gas, no matter how remote it was. Additionally, it displayed the costs of both leaded and unleaded gasoline, which had been prohibited since the mid-1990s at the latest. Something else finally dawned on me as my mind tried to comprehend this. There was silence in the whole woodland surrounding the station. Furthermore, I'm not referring to a typical silence. The owl, the crickets, and the rustle of what I had assumed to be elk or deer in the trees were all gone. The wind had even appeared to have stopped. The silence was almost otherworldly, as though the forest as a whole were holding its breath. It sent a chill up my spine and was, to put it mildly, really disturbing and eerie. All I could hear was the buzz of the lights above, which seemed to drone like a snarling beast and was almost too loud. Though I couldn't figure out why, I became aware that every muscle in my body had stiffened up. The silence is unsettling, to be sure, but I didn't think there was anything to be really terrified of. Even though I kept telling myself that, I couldn't help but feel more tense in the silence. I eventually shouted, "Okay, fuck this!" Pulling myself off my hood and starting toward the entrance. Harold had entered, the sound of even my own echoing voice seeming just wrong to me. I noticed that another 15 minutes had gone by when I checked the watch on my wrist as I was walking. What on earth is he doing? I eventually arrived at the door and grasped the handle, letting out a sigh of annoyance as well as an attempt to ease the strange feeling that was starting to grow in my stomach. I twisted it fast, opening the door and making the bell clang too loudly in the silence, even though it felt almost startlingly cold in my hand. The bell jingled again, this time softly, inside the building as I entered and let it swing shut behind me. I took a look around. There was no food or drink in the room except for an antique Coca-Cola machine in one corner. Rather, the 2 or 3 aisles that occupied the majority of the room were lined with what appeared to be vintage motor oil cans and other various automobile accessories, all of which were branded with the dinosaur. I took a deep breath and gave a tiny cough. The air in here seemed a bit musty, as though it hadn't been let out in a while. I could see the counter where Harold must normally be working if I looked straight ahead. It was topped with an antiquated cash register, and behind it was an open door that read, "Employees Only." There was a lengthy tiled hallway beyond it that continued for a while before vanishing around a turn. The cash register caught my attention. I thought, I haven't seen one of these old jobs since I was a kid in the 1990s. As a few sentimental feelings began to pierce my other feelings and pull at my heart. However, it was swiftly chased away by the unsettling sensation that was hovering over me like a dust cloud. Everything about this place appeared a little off. I had no idea why, but it felt like insects were crawling under my skin on my arms and legs. I hesitated for a second before opening my mouth. "Hey, Harold?" Like the bell, my voice seemed muted when I called. I waited. No response. "Are you back there, Harold?" I gave another call. Nothing has changed. I craned my neck to peer down the corridor, feeling more and more tense as the fluorescent lights in here seemed to be buzzing too loudly as well. I could just make out the bright blue sign for a restroom at the corner. I decided and called out once more. "Look, Harold, if you hear me, I'm going to the bathroom now, over here. Until I reach the next town, I can't hold it." It was a lie. Even though I felt strange, I didn't want to get into trouble just in case he came around the corner, so I didn't eat or drink anything in the previous 2 hours to force me to leave. I still didn't want to annoy him. I inhaled deeply before jumping over the counter and into the hallway. This was illuminated by 3 or 4 incandescent light bulbs hanging from the ceiling, in contrast to the main area. It made the hall appear a little darker than it did behind me, and I paused before beginning to walk along it, being careful not to make too much noise with my footfall. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a corner in the hall. I turned the bathroom handle and opened it, wanting to maintain appearances. I glanced at it for a moment, then hastily closed it, choking back a gag and cough. It had a repulsive appearance, as if it hadn't been cleaned in decades. As I turned around, I saw that the next section of the corridor had a brighter light. After giving it some thought, I started down it. I just wanted to leave this place. Another door was open, and I looked through it to see the vista outdoors and the 2 garage bays. I was a little relieved by the rush of cool, clean air, and I went on. Upon arriving at the doorway, I turned to find that it was an office. Inside were 2 desks, each with a nameplate on the edge. Harold's name was spied on the far one. In addition, I noticed my credit card in the center of the table. Its vivid blue color contrasted with the white papers and dark wood. I sighed with relief, hurried over to it, and grabbed it up. Instead, I made the decision to put $20 and $10 in cash on the desk and left immediately. I had no idea where the man had disappeared to, and I felt compelled to go. I was reaching for my wallet when I noticed a fake gold plaque glinting in the dim light on the wall behind the desk. I gazed at it. Harold looked almost exactly how I had seen him in the photo, but more cleaner. It was unmistakably his. A statement engraved on the counterfeit gold lay behind that. Harold Jankowski was named the Employee of the Month. Given how hard he must have worked for it, I couldn't help but smile. But when I read the inscription beneath it, the smile vanished from my face less than a second later. August 1976. I shook my head in the hopes that I was only seeing things in the dark and that the year would be 2006 or, worse, 1996. However, no. Nothing changed. What the fuck? I exhaled as a chill went through my body once more. He would not have looked the same 46 years later if he had appeared to be in his 40s or 50s in the middle of his 70s. He would most likely no longer be employed here, as he would be in his 70s or 90s. I said, "What the hell is going on?" once more. I turned to book it out of the room and out of the station altogether, because I felt like fear was penetrating the darkness and squeezing itself inside of me. But when I saw Harold, I froze. In the adjacent room, he sat with his back to me in an antique black swivel chair. The room had a really eerie feel to it, but I couldn't determine what it was because it was only illuminated by a single, really dim lamp just over him. I experienced the first stirrings of fear for the first time in years. He started talking before I could move or say anything. "All right, Mr. Damascus," he murmured, his tone nearly unintelligible. I started talking. He went on. "Look, I'm sorry I barged back in here, it's just—" But I was interrupted. "Well, how are you feeling, Mr. Damascus?" I felt a flood of bewilderment sweep over me, and my shoulders dropped. Excuse me? I succeeded. "How are you feeling?" He said it again, then went on, his voice now appearing to have some rhythm. "Are you feeling scared? Are you afraid?" He laughed softly, and it sounded nearly different from the joyful laugh I had heard outside. I was unsure of how to react. At last, he spoke once more. "You don't need to tell me, it's all right. I can feel it, I know." He laughed again, and I got several chills across my body. With his back to me, he stood up and added, "And honestly, Mr. Damascus, I'm happy about that. Because you all taste so much better when you're afraid." This time, I did manage to say something. It wasn't the most poetic answer, but Harold seemed to think it was humorous because he gave another low, eerie laugh. "The fuck?" When he finally turned to face me, I leaped back and slammed against his desk, knocking his nameplate on the floor. The man continued to smile at me, but now there was a distinct wideness to his smile, a wickedness that bordered on pants-possessing. He didn't appear to be alive, though. His once glistening green eyes appeared watery and blind. To be honest, he looked more like a puppet or dummy used by ventriloquists than anything else. He appeared to lean in my direction. At last, he said something. However, I'll make it athletic. He said, "You have 20 seconds to run." I swallowed hard and turned to see a tire iron on his desk. I grabbed it, prepared to strike the man over the head if he attempted to approach me. He just fell forward upon his face at that point. Halfway into the room, he fell and remained motionless. I gasped when I saw what I was looking at when I looked down at him. The man had the appearance of a deflated beach ball, as if all of his blood and organs had been sucked out. Once more. Or I noticed the rip in the back of his jumpsuit, but it was much more noticeable this time. His filthy white shirt behind it had also been ripped, exposing, oh fuck me sideways, a hole in his real back. In the golden light, I could make out the white of his spine. I heard a voice as I looked down at him. But this one wasn't Harold's. It was considerably lower than any human voice I had ever heard, and it appeared to come from both everywhere and nowhere at once. It had such a cruel, genuinely nasty tone that it nearly made me throw up. 20. 19, 18 years old. 17. I glanced up into the dimly lit room from where Harold had fallen. Finally, I let out a scream for the first time in years. Two huge, brilliant green eyes hovered just beyond the periphery of the feeble light's vision, in the darkness. They had an extremely unnatural shape, resembling crescent moons, and were larger than a human's eyes could ever be. I have never in my life witnessed such vile, cruel glee. The voice stopped counting down as I screamed, and it fucking laughed. A loud, booming laugh that resembled blackboard nails. Then it started counting down once more, and you could hear the malevolent excitement in it. 16. 50 foot. There was no more waiting for me. I didn't want to see who owned those eyes. My footsteps and frantic breathing echoed back to me like a gunshot as I turned and ran out of the office, down the hallway. I couldn't understand why it was taking so long to get to the intersection when the corridor seemed to continue on forever. But at last I got there and stopped. I had returned to the office entrance. What the devil? I heard the voice behind me hit 10, and I started running down the corridor once more. Reaching the corner appeared to take even longer this time, so I extended my hand to grasp the corner edge, only to grab the office door's wooden edge instead. As I ran again, my eyes grew wide, and I could feel the tears starting to pour. As I ran down the ever-widening hallway, the voice persisted. 7, 6, 5. I pushed off the edge of the corridor to snatch at the tiled corner, letting out a strangled sob as I did so. I hit the wall adjacent to the office door instead. When I heard it complete, I collapsed in a heap and struggled to get back up. 3, 2, 1. Mr. Damascus, are you ready or not? Right here. I arrive. The voice became much lower as it finished speaking, as though I were listening to the devil himself speak. I realized I could see it if I turned to look behind me right now, standing over its human puppet in the center of the workplace. I knew it wanted me to glance back, so I didn't. Along with the blood from my head where I had crashed into the wall, tears streamed down my cheeks. I had flashbacks of every horror movie death I had ever seen or read about, and I was aware that none of them were nearly as terrible as what that creature had in store for me. At that moment, a thought, a small flicker of hope came to me, something I had noticed on my way to the office down the hall. I had a surge of adrenaline. I had to try, I thought, even though I could die trying. Hot, foul-smelling breath landed on the back of my neck as I heard the floor behind me rattle. I was gripped by fear for a split second before letting out a strangled shriek and leaping into movement. Behind me, I heard a roar of annoyance, then a chuckle. It was aware that it would use whatever strength it has to return me to the end of the passageway. This passage was under its control. However, it is unaware that it left a vulnerability exposed. This time, I couldn't help but scream as I sprinted down the hallway, the thought still reverberating in my head. At the halfway mark, I saw what I had hoped to spy, even if it felt more longer than before. Standing open and nearly obscured by an oil shelf was the garage door. I cried out once more, this time with resolve. I heard the thing stop chuckling behind me. It realized what I was going to do and now roared with wrath. It started to thunder up the hallway after me, trying to grab me. My back felt like it was being slashed by something sharp. Then I was running for the door, as well as via it. The Cadillac was decaying away from decades of neglect when I fell in a pool of still sticky oil underneath it. Without any delay, I leaped to my feet and sprinted towards the open bay doors. I heard a louder bellow behind me, but I chose not to turn around. Now, filled with the sounds of the woodland once more, I bounded out of the doors into the darkness. I nearly flew over the hood of my car as I ran for it and tore open the driver's door. For an instant, I was afraid that, like the usual horror cliché, it wouldn't start, so I slammed into the seat and jabbed at the start button. To my astonishment and appreciation, it did, with the V6's deafening roar. I took a chance and looked up as I reached for the knob to press into drive. And I had to let out another scream. There was no light in the whole gas station. The interior, the lights above, everything. All I could make out was the building's outline. The eyes, too. From inside the bays, the eyes glared at me with utter disdain and anger. With my foot jammed down on the pedal, I continued to yell and stare at them. The automobile hurtled ahead like a rocket, ripping out from beneath the canopy and into the road as the tires screamed. I didn't want to check the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see those eyes one last time, even though I knew I would. My hands were white as I grasped the wheel and drove away from the hell behind me, but I just kept my eyes on the road ahead as far as my headlights could reach. I take the corners far too quickly and hardly ever take my foot off the gas pedal. Not until the following town, whose name escapes me, finally came into view with its welcoming lights. I could feel myself starting to cry, happy, relieved tears this time. I went directly to the police station by car. They would assume I was completely crazy or on something, so I knew I could never tell them what had truly occurred to me. However, I was able to inform them that I had been attacked at an old gas station by a crazy person. And I did precisely that. I rushed in and begged to talk to someone. When I showed them my back, which turned out to have 3 deep slashes in it, the officers at the counter calmed me down and took my statement extremely seriously. However, both of their faces displayed bewildered expressions when I informed them of the location. One of the officers entered the rear and came back with the on-duty sergeant, an elderly man in his 60s, while a paramedic hurried in from the outside to examine my injuries. He kindly said, "Tell me again what happened to you." I did, and he shook his head when I was done. He said, "Son, it couldn't have happened at the Sinclair station 10 or 12 miles back." I stumbled. "Well, why not?" I struggled for words as I made my demand. "Because," he said, "a massive fire destroyed it and killed everyone inside, leading to its closure in 1979. Nearly 6 months have passed since that occurred." Erin called me angrily because I didn't show up for my book signing. When she learned that I had been attacked, her rage subsided. I informed her that it had come from a person I had stopped on the side of the road trying to assist. The conversation I had with the cops was not one I wanted to repeat. They promised to look for the person who attacked me, but I'm sure they won't. Not until they showed me an old, yellowed newspaper item that depicted the burned-out ruins of the gas station I had seen, and next to it a very familiar picture of a happy man. I continued to write horror. I continued to write despite the horror I witnessed that evening. This year marks the release of my 2nd book. However, I now get shivers of fear from my own creation every time I sit down at my computer and start writing a really scary scenario, because I am aware that there are real atrocities in this world, and I hope I don't see them ever again. I'm sharing this here as a caution, as well as to finally be honest about what I went through. To whoever will listen, what if you someday find yourself in the middle of nowhere on a desolate 2-lane road in the Pacific Northwest, and you arrive upon an old-looking gas station with a fading green Brontosaurus logo whirling in the darkness? Just keep moving forward and keep your foot firmly planted. Since you might not be as fortunate as I was,